with great pleasure that we introduce to you this evening Acting Lord Mayor Nicholas Reece, who was elected Deputy Lord Mayor in November 2020 after having previously been elected Councillor in the City of Melbourne in 2016. Acting Lord Mayor Nicholas Reece is Portfolio Lead for City Planning and Deputy Lead for Finance, Governance and Risk and Heritage Portfolios. Welcome.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's absolutely wonderful to be here, and I can't wait to get into talking about the give and to hear from the contributors this evening. This is such an important topic at such a critical time for Melbourne. I'm sorry if I was a few minutes late there. I actually thought I'd arrived on time, but luckily I arrived in time to hear Kate's address. Thank you so much for your remarks and your insights. I really do think you understand the rhythm of cities as well as anyone I know. So thank you so much, Kate. Let's give it up for Kate again. Can I also thank our friends from the Royal Danish Consul, Ricky and Nikolai. I can't see actually in the out through the light over there, but they are over there. And thank you so much for putting on this evening and everything that you do in the City of Melbourne and the State of Victoria. And can I also thank our good friends from LINAK here this evening, Patrick Ramsden, Chris Gibbs and many others I know. It's great also to see so many distinguished guests and good friends in the audience this evening, particularly my dear friend Jill Garner, the State Architect. I wasn't nervous until I saw she was here, but now I most certainly am. I'll begin with a quick acknowledgement of country. I'll do that in the Wurundjeri, the Woiwurrung language of the Wurundjeri people. And so I say to you, Wominjenka, Maranbik, Burundak, Wurundjeri, William, U, Liwik, U, Kulun, Yirambu, Ba, Yirambo. That is a language which has been spoken on these lands for 2,000 generations. I've been asked to speak this evening about the topic of promoting sustainability and social inclusion in office and city design. It's a very, very big topic. Before I dive into that, I do want to have a look at some of the patterns of human life that have changed in Melbourne over recent years. Then I'll turn to the future outlook for the city and how I believe this is really a defining decade for Melbourne. And then finally, I want to look at two issues relating to sustainability and resilience of the city of Melbourne. I should begin with a quick disclaimer. It is the last day of Movember. So this filthy mustache that I've got on at the moment, this is not the normal me that you're looking at the moment. This is Movember Nick. And if you're feeling a little bit sorry for me up here with this unsightly thing, then please sponsor Movember and support men's health. I should also begin by confessing to you that I'm a very long-standing fan of Danish design and urban planning. I was very fortunate to travel to Copenhagen in 2019 and spent time really getting under the hood of city government in Copenhagen and how they go about running that city. And when I returned to Melbourne, I wrote a column that ran in the Age newspaper. Looking back at it, it was certainly a love letter, I think, to Copenhagen. But I might just read you a short extract of it, and I think certainly if there's any Danes here this evening, I think they will like it. So I wrote, imagine a city with beautiful and protected public squares and boulevards, a city obsessed with good design and urban planning, where medium density neighbourhoods are walkable and well serviced by public transport. A wealthy city that is becoming even more prosperous by leading the world in sustainable industry. A city that plans to be carbon neutral by 2025 and where just 3% of household waste ends up in landfill. A city whose population is measured in the millions, yet where the majority of people cycle or walk to work or school each day. These achievements are a distant memory a distant dream for most Australian cities. Our civic leaders could scarcely imagine a place that combined them all. Happily, they don't have to, because such a city already exists in the Scandinavian city of Copenhagen. COVID-19 pandemic has created fertile ground for politicians to dream of big reforms for a better Australia. And at the top of that list should be the challenge, how do we make Melbourne the Copenhagen of the South? Now, I copped a bit of stick when I wrote that. I had a lot of Melburnians sort of emailing me or sidling up to me at parties and saying, "Do you know about this, Copenhagen of the South? We should be the Melbourne of the South. Maybe Copenhagen should be the Melbourne of the North." But notwithstanding the fact that, of course, Melbourne is the greatest city in the world and has so much to offer every city in the world in terms of learnings, I also think you must all agree that Copenhagen does stand as a great source of knowledge and insights which we can benefit from. Turning to the topic of tonight's discussion, I wanted to go to a slide to show you in graphic form the impact of the social restrictions that Melbourne faced off the back of the COVID pandemic. Probably everybody here doesn't need to be retold that Melbourne was indeed the most locked down city in the world. And, even 2 years on, our city and most cities around the world are different places. Now, if you want to see what an exogenous shock looks like in an economy or in a city, this graph is a good representation of that. I picked the city of Melbourne. We do pedestrian sensors all around the city, so we can measure how many people in the city on any day of the week and where they're going, and we map the patterns of the city. And I picked Town Hall West because it's a really good. So that's the Capitol Theatre. That stretch of Swanston Street there. It's a really good measure of activity in the city on one sensor because it gives you a mix of business traffic, retail, events, and residents as well. And what it sort of spells out is what happened to Melbourne during that lockdown period. That the city went from being a place which attracted about 1 million people on a working day to, at the peak of the lockdowns, was a city with around 50,000 people. So if you want to know what an exogenous shock looks like for a city, try draining 950,000 people and then see what happens. And so you can see that just massive drop-off in activity that happened through 2020. You see it sort of bouncing back again, or sort of starting to come back through 2021, and you just rides through the roller coaster of those lockdowns. The good news is that pedestrian activity has recovered quite strongly in the city of Melbourne, but the way that people interact with the city, the patterns of human behaviour have changed quite significantly, which I will explain. Let's just go to the next slide and I just will show you. So again, this is Town Hall West, my favourite pedestrian sensor in the city. And this shows what's been happening over the course of the second half of 2023. And the dark blue line there is to the 2019 benchmark. And the orange line is what we're currently seeing. So as you can see, weekly pedestrian activity is largely back to where it was in 2019. But as I said, as you average that out over the course of the week, it's roughly back to where it was. But the variances from one time of the day to another, from one day of the week, has moved very, very significantly. So, for example, Sundays are now busier than Mondays in the CBD. Let me just say that to you again. In the central business district, a Sunday is now busier than Monday. in terms of footfall through the city. The nighttime economy, if I can shorthand it as that, is absolutely flying. To see an example of that, just look at the top of Bourke Street or the kind of Korean precinct down on King Street. They're absolutely thriving. There's hot pots, ramens, every variety of bubble tea, these new flagship restaurants being opened by Chris Lucas, Justin Hems and others. Just at the top end of Bourke Street, from Exhibition up to Spring, I estimate there's close to 2,000 new jobs being created as a result of all these new restaurants that have either recently opened or will open in the next 12 to 18 months. It's absolutely huge. The other very interesting thing that has happened is that we see changes in which days of the week people are coming in, and Kate touched on this before. So close to 70% of what we believe to be workplace commuter activity happens on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. I heard that called the twat economy the other day. Not sure if that's going to stick. But what that does tell you is that Mondays and Fridays are still down on where they were in 2019, and during the day is still down on where it was in 2019 as well, but has recovered quite considerably. Evenings are up on every day of the week. Saturday and Sunday is well up on where it was in 2019 as well. What do I think lies behind those changes in human behaviour? Well, in terms of the nighttime economy and the weekend economy, I think a lot of that is people wanting to, not living every day like it's their last or anything like that, but certainly wanting to make the most of life and getting out, having experiences, whether that's going to the theatre, going to a restaurant, going out for some sort of art exhibition opening or some sort of activity. It'll be very interesting to see how that sector of the economy travels over the next 12 months as cost of living pressures start to bite, and whether people adjust backwards around that part of their weekly expenditure. The other really interesting thing that's been happening in the central city economy is the return of international students. So 2022 was international student numbers were back to about 70% of what they were pre-COVID, through 2023 back to about 90%. For 2024, the enrolments are now looking like they're going to be about 105% of 2019. So 2024 is going to be the biggest and busiest year ever for Melbourne in terms of international students, which is a very, very good thing for the Melbourne economy, given the input that having just in the municipality of Melbourne, it's about 80,000 international students, an extraordinary injection of activity and vibrancy into our city. The other really interesting macroeconomic driver at the moment is the uptick in interstate and international tourism. And I might go to the next slide just to look at this point. And so we've seen interstate tourism doing really well through 2023. International tourism has been weaker. That has largely been driven by political factors relating to China. But with the Chinese government recently saying that Melbourne was a good destination, Australia was a good destination for group travel, the expectation is that we'll see those international tourism numbers really coming back strongly in 2024. And certainly if the number of new flights that are currently commencing to Melbourne is anything to go by, that pipeline is really about to open up. So, for example, I just last week met with the Mayor of Chengdu, who was here announcing there'll be 5 flights a week into Melbourne on Sichuan Airlines. bringing all the good folks from Chengdu and West China here, and we're seeing that across the board with the Chinese airlines at the moment. So that's a great sign for the economy. And look, what this goes to is the fact that the Melbourne economy has become quite diversified. Kate touched on the postcode 3000 policy of the 1990s, and that's just one factor in it, but a very, very important one. So in the 1990s, there were about 400 people living in the central city of Melbourne. Since 2002, there's been 68,000 new apartments added, and there are now about 106,000 people living in Central City, Docklands or South Bank, and that's expected to grow by about another 100,000 if you take into account Fisherman's Bend over the next decade and a bit. So we're expecting huge growth in population for the municipality of Melbourne. We've also seen that diversification in the city economy as well, which means that we have Melbourne being much more, not as fragile as many other central cities in the world. Which this really goes to a point I find in my role as Deputy Mayor in Melbourne. I get the great pleasure of participating in phone hookups with mayors around the world, and they always seem to talk about the same thing, and it's that their desire to diversify their central cities. They want to be not just central business districts, but they want to be places where where theatre goers can come and see a show, where there's art exhibitions, where there's a vibrant restaurant and live performances and music. And I sort of sit there thinking, gee, well, we've sort of already got all that in Melbourne. And we've had it for some period of time now. And it does go to the fact that the central city economy of Melbourne, notwithstanding the biggest exogenous shock in 100 years, has recovered very well over the last 12 months or so. Now, that's not to say that there's not some significant heartache that has occurred out there. Many businesses that have relied on the office worker economy have really, really struggled. You know, if you're a dry cleaner or a sort of a sandwich bar sort of serving office workers, then the times have been pretty tough. But equally, there's been many new businesses that open, particularly in hospitality and entertainment economy as well. I want to talk now about what I see as a real defining decade for Melbourne. The trillion-dollar question, and sorry, just to sort of spell that out a little bit, I really think that the 2020s are going to be as important for Melbourne as the 1920s were, or arguably any decade that this city has ever experienced. If you think back to the 1919, you had the Spanish flu, and that was followed by the roaring 1920s. For Melbourne, we had the COVID-19. I think we're really going to be in for a really strong period of growth for Melbourne over the 2020s. But I also think there is going to be some huge challenges there for us as a city as well. Challenges that are going to challenge us mightily, and are going to require some real leadership from government, but also from business and indeed across all sectors in Melbourne. So if I think about what those big challenges are, we can start with one that I know occupies the mind of Arup and many of those here. It's sort of the trillion-dollar question for the property sector, and that is, are workers going to return to the office? If you want to be more pointed about it, you might say, are they going to come back after the summer holidays that we're about to go into? In cities like San Francisco, they talk about the death spiral. Now, I don't think Melbourne's going to face anything like a death spiral. In fact, if anything, I think we're going to set ourselves up for an unrivaled period of prosperity. But you can see what's happened in San Francisco. They've fallen for the classic mistake of their central business district being just that, a business district, not having that diversity of economic bases and activities. And so when COVID-19 came along, and then as a consequence of that, people shifted to home working, they just haven't now come back. I'd put it to you also that that San Francisco has a very big problem with fentanyl as well. And, maybe they started by getting on top of some of those issues. They might find that their workforces are more readily likely to come back. But I do think for Melbourne, answering that $1 trillion question about getting workers back is all about playing to those strengths of the city as not just being a great place to work, but a place where you can collaborate with your colleagues, where you build that social capital that Kate talked about, and where you can do a whole bunch of other great things in the course of a working day, which make you a happier and more productive human being. The other big challenge coming centres, I think, around the population boom that is heading Australia's way. I'm sure you've read in recent weeks about the 500,000 people that have come to Australia in the last year. Now, in some ways, that is making up for the fact that we're about a million people down on where we otherwise would have been from the fact that our borders got closed during those COVID years, and a lot of people left the country as well for the first time since Federation. Australia had a net decline in population as more people left than came here. But nonetheless, to have 500,000 people flowing into Australia and another 450,000 scheduled to come in the next 12 months, that is going to put new pressures on Australia's cities. There are currently 200,000 people waiting for assistance into housing in Australia. Rents are soaring. And the fact is, and this is a big, big discussion, we do need to think of new models of housing. We need to think of new types of home design. And hardest of all, at least politically, we need to think about how we tackle this idea of the investor class distorting the housing sector. And to that end, I see that Alan Kohler has just released a quarterly essay on that very topic, which I really commend to you all as summer reading. The other thing, of course, is the shape of our cities needs to change. When I think of the population distribution map of of Melbourne, where it's like a giant pancake that runs about 100 kilometres wide, more than that, and population density is dead flat for most of that the pancake, except for right in the middle where there's like a needle standing upright, which is the central city. It's not and it's of course part of this Faustian political bargain that has happened in Melbourne, where it's almost sky's the limit in the central city, but out in the suburbs, it's 1-2 stories, and pretty much that is it. And so that also provides a big challenges for us, with vast swathes of greater metropolitan Melbourne locked up from even modest mid-rise. So I think that's going to be a huge challenge, but also an opportunity for our cities. Finally, I just want to talk about how we make Melbourne more resilient and sustainable. And to that end, I was delighted to recently release the Melbourne retrofitting plan. So we know that to meet our emissions targets in Melbourne, that we need our buildings to be far more sustainable. In Melbourne, 66% of our carbon emissions come from buildings. That reflects the density and concentration of the built form in our municipality. So if Melbourne's going to meet its reduction targets, and if Victoria and Australia are going to meet our reduction targets, we need to make sure our buildings are far more sustainable. And part of that means tackling the existing housing stock as well. Now, the policy challenge here is that there is not really an effective policy mechanism. There's some interventions there. It's not a policy blank space, but there is not really an effective policy mechanism in place that is going to help leverage the shift we need, the transition in existing building stock. And so we certainly can't do it alone at the City of Melbourne. We're going to need help, Jill, from state government, and we're going to need assistance, probably financially, I would suggest, from federal government as well. But at the City of Melbourne, we have made a commitment to reducing or seeing about 80 buildings per year transition to being retrofitted to meet new environmental standards. And at the moment, we're tracking at about 7 buildings a year. So there's quite an uptick that is required in activity. And so as part of our retrofitting plan, we have signalled that we are investigating the use of emissions caps on buildings. A number of cities around the world have done this. I've been in particular following the local law 97 in New York, where it's actually starting in January 2024. So I know many of you are really into this area of policy. And so just watching what happens from January in New York is going to be absolutely fascinating. They estimate there's about 10% of the existing building stock which is currently non-compliant, and so that will require action from January. But of course, what's going to happen over time is that's going to ratchet up, requiring more and more of the building stock to be upgraded, and that will, if you're trying to manage a transition process, those numbers probably sound about right. The other thing that we're looking at in the City of Melbourne is how our rates might be used to provide incentives for building owners to undertake retrofitting activities to upgrade as well. And so that's something that we're looking at very, very closely. I will just finish by touching on 2 quick infrastructure projects, which would be remiss of me as the Deputy Lord Mayor not to touch on as in a presentation to an audience like this one. So we could just go to the last slide. And that, of course, is Green Line, which is the City of Melbourne's plan to transform the north bank of the Yarra River. So if you all think about, the south bank of the Yarra and what happened there in the 1990s and what's happened since, it's a fabulous example of urban transformation. And we want to see essentially the same thing happen on the north bank of the river. And then finally, for those of you who haven't yet haven't recently been up to have a walk around the Queen Victoria Market and the extraordinary transformation that's happening there, I really would encourage you to go and visit soon. And just this week, we've actually opened the new Nam Nagu Library. Of course, the opening of a public library is always cause for great celebration in a city, and it is that and more for Melbourne, because I think it's one of the most fabulous new libraries that this country has ever seen. And it's great to see James Legg here from 6 Degrees. Of course, the 6 Degrees team did some amazing work on that new library. So put it in your calendars for this weekend. Go and check out Melbourne's new library. I'm very much happy to stick around and take questions. Thank you so much again for inviting me this evening. This is a defining decade for Melbourne, and all of us collectively need to step up to meet the challenge and the opportunity of this decade. Thank you very much for having me on this evening.